If if people don't want aren't comfortable with recording, you can change your name and turn off your video.
Well, welcome everybody. I'm just going to get us started right away. We traditionally do this acknowledgement every time we meet, and it was given to us by Grandma Esther Stutzman, and I'm just going to read it real quickly tonight, and then after that, if people could share, acknowledge the tribal area where they live when I'm done. Okay. This is the land of the Kalapuya Nation, stretching from the Umpqua River to the south and northward to the falls at Oregon City. 3 dialects of the language were spoken throughout the Willamette Valley, with 12 or so distinct groups within this area. Although Kalapuya people were primarily removed to reservations at Siletz and Grand Ronde, they remain aware of their rich heritage and traditions on this land. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, which we call home, the Kalapuya people, and we pay our respect to the elders, both past and present.
Thank you, Katie.
Sure.
And with that, oh yeah. Anybody else have land acknowledgements from where they're living?
Yeah, I live on the lands of the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Confederated Tribes.
I'm living in the state of Guanajuato, and the tribe that is known for this area is the Otomi, though the general name for many indigenous groups was Chichimeca.
Next.
Yes, I'd like to acknowledge the Umpqua and the Coos tribes.
I'm in the land of the Alsea. I'm not sure if there's another name for them, but these are the tribes that live along the banks in the upper Alsea region.
You know, that makes me think when you mention what their other name is, it would be good for us to learn the native names of where we live, because I know like the Siuslaw, it's a word that's really hard to pronounce, but it's something like Shayushlaw. But it would be good for our tongues to have to wrestle with their names.
True. Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. And at this time, we'll go on to our presentation. We're really happy to have Christopher Hall of Water League presenting to us regarding his work on water and water issues. Welcome, Christopher.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen and load the Zoom with the PowerPoint. Well, we'll ask real quick, can you all see the PowerPoint slide?
I see it.
Yep.
Okay. Well, my name is Christopher Hall, and I'm the Executive Director of Water League. We're a small nonprofit organization, and the title of this presentation is Resolving Conflict with Our Future Selves. The subtitle is The Beneficial Use of Water for Posterity, which posterity means future generations. And by that, we mean the literal use of water to secure our future. All views and opinions expressed here are representative of Water League and Water League only. So let's see here. There we go. Water League engages the public in water stewardship. It's a very simple and very straightforward mission. And I mean, we usually like to start out with something pretty. This is Little Grayback Creek. Little Grayback Creek is a tributary to the, it is the tributary to the East Fork of the Illinois River. And the Illinois River is the main stem that flows into the Rogue River out into the Pacific Ocean. And it's the name that is at the base of the Illinois Valley, hence the region that we're in. This river has what are called base flows. That's cold water coming in from groundwater, and it's about mid-September. This is a lovely little creek that is very healthy and pristine, and this is an example of what all rivers really ought to look like. Water League engages the public in water stewardship on the topics of water use and water quality, equitable access to water, conservation of water for posterity, beneficial use preferences and priorities, the public interest as it applies to water use, the connection between the environmental health and public health, the public trust doctrine, and rights and responsibilities to nature. We added the bit about responsibilities to acknowledge that while we may try to give rights to nature, we also have a reciprocal need to take responsibility for how we interact. Water League acknowledges and honors all the Indigenous peoples who've made their homes since time immemorial throughout the areas where Water League works and upon whose ancestral homelands we live. Water League acknowledges the care by which Indigenous inhabitants have stewarded precious natural resources for millennia and seeks to be of service within this historical framework. At Water League, we hold biospheric values, and we mean the value of recognizing that each of us is the closest to nature that we will ever get, that our bodies are the closest to water that we'll ever be, and that caring for how we act as a valued element or emanation of nature. How we treat water is how we treat ourselves and how we treat others. We invite all to get in league with water, which is really getting in league with each other. Therefore, we see this as building community and connections with all creatures, flora, fauna, humans, mountains, rivers, glades, meadows, and aquifers. So now we're going to dive into this presentation, and it's going to start with taking a look at how settlers and their successors have used, extracted, and exploited water. And I just want to take a moment here to point out that if we are the closest to water that we'll ever get, if we are water, 60 to 70% of our bodies are water, then we might consider, like, what does it mean to use water, to extract water, to exploit water? Because we don't do that to our family members, to our friends, and really to anybody. Those traits are antisocial, even sociopathic. And so we're contextualizing the context of using extraction and exploitation in that manner. So start with here, this chart, which comes from the business case for investing in water in Oregon in 2023. The Oregon Water Resources Department, the Oregon Water Resources Commission, rather, they're the ones who requested this study. And it really is the study is the look at what's the value of investing in water in the state. This chart shows on the left where water comes from, the water sources, and on the right, what the uses are. And we'll see that surface water comprises about 78% of all the water that flows in the state that we use, and then groundwater is about 22%. On the other side of the equation, interestingly, irrigation happens to use 78% of all the water, which is a combination of both surface and groundwater. And then you'll see a few other numbers up here. I'll start with the domestic self-supply. That's 1% of all the water in the state that's diverted from surface or groundwater. And that happens to include all the domestic wells. We'll see the public supply is 9%. That's all the municipal public water supplies that service every city and every other family and industrial commercial use, Facebook, server farms, you name it. And then aquaculture and hatchery is 10%, and that's a lot of pass-through water that comes into the fisheries and then heads back out again. But you'll see that 78% of all water is used by large-scale water right holding irrigators. And I just will point out that 1.5% of Oregon's GDP is accounted for by irrigation. So irrigated agriculture accounts for 1.5% of Oregon's GDP, which is a very small amount, especially given how much water we see irrigation uses. This other chart is only about groundwater. It's just looking at the way we punch wells into the earth. The blue refers to the number or the percent of wells, how many wells are there? And then the red refers to the water use, like how much water use. So for instance, on the left, under domestic, we'll see that domestic wells account for 88% of all wells. That's about 225,000 wells in the state of Oregon, but they only use 4% of the groundwater. Next to that is irrigation use. They account for 7% of the wells, but they use 82% of all the water. And then the next one over under where it says community, that's really the municipal and public water supplies. They account for 1% of the wells. They use 10% of the water. And I'll remind us that about 85% or so of Oregonians get their water from municipal public water supplies. So that community section right there, that's all the water that's used within cities. Again, commercial, industrial, coming out your tap, you name it. We center our discussion on big ag irrigation because big ag uses 78% of all the water diversions. And by this, we want to just point out early on that we will never wring enough water out of communities and their public municipal water supplies to conserve our way to sustainability. That's because there's just not enough water to conserve from those small portions. It's going to have to come commensurate with the scope of use from the 78% of irrigation if we are to preserve and conserve water for the future. And then we have some perspective here, and this is not unlike other states. 5% of Oregon's farms account for and are equal to 80% of the $5 billion industry. As I've pointed out before, $5 billion isn't really all that much. It might just be one or two counties in California. But for Oregon, it's a similar percentage. It's a very small number, accounts for a very large portion. 10% of the operations account for 87% of the acreage. That's a result of a lot of consolidation. As a kid, I grew up on an apple orchard in Vermont, around 150 acres of apples on a 200-acre plot. It was a decent-sized farm for that region. And we used to have a New Yorker cartoon on our fridge, and it showed a little fairy tapping a farmer driving a tractor on the shoulder with her wand saying, every 20 minutes, a small farm goes out of business. And this was in the early 80s. So consolidation has been going on for a long time, and it's an important consideration to keep mind of. 95% of farms are what we typically see in daily life when we're like driving around. And I just want to make it very clear, they pose little to no threat to water sources. 95% of farms are really using not that much water in terms of the threats that are posed to ecosystems and communities. This is the Cave Junction Farmers Market. I was lucky to be one of the folks who founded this lovely event. It happens 6-7 months a year, and we have hundreds and hundreds of people. And these folks are not the folks who are posing a threat to our watershed. I just want to make that clear. In 1790, farmers comprised 90% of the population. By 2020, the population of farmers dropped to 1%. Despite that reduction, today, industrial irrigators use unsustainable amounts of water that are 8 times as much as all other water uses combined. All water in the state belongs to the public, and that's by law. It's an actual statute, and that's similar across all the states in the West. The less than 1.5% in Oregon who have water rights use the vast majority of water in the state, as was seen in those charts. Water inequity results when the water use benefits the user, but harms the other 98.5% of the public. And that little asterisk there says that this is kind of the punchline towards the end of the presentation. So this will become relevant at the very end. But just be mindful that water inequity is a result when the water use benefits the user, but harms the rest of the public. And I think I'll just drop in a little example. In the Illinois Valley in Southwest Oregon, in 2021, our Southwest region was sacked by organized crime syndicates who came from, mostly Eastern Europe, but some bros from Humboldt County. And they set up cannabis grows that increased the acreage by over 450% over the past 60 years. It was an explosion, and they wreaked havoc on the region. And the public was outraged. Now, we'll point out that water use was likely considered a benefit by the organized crime syndicates who used that water, but to the rest of the community and to other members of the state, they didn't think so. And so there's a big difference there. When we talk about water use must be in the public interest as well as obviously in the interest of the user. Now, Oregon exports 80% of all agricultural crop products, and 40% cross the state lines, 40% go abroad. And conventionally, this is viewed as a great success. That's like the conventional wisdom. But our water goes with those exports in the form of virtual water exports. And if it were the case that our Mediterranean climate wasn't struggling for water, every year for about 6 to 7 or 8 months a year, and we weren't in significant droughts with climate change, then maybe it wouldn't matter. But those virtual water exports are a significant concern. Also, those statistics point out that Oregonians don't really eat or wear that much irrigation since so many agricultural products leave the state. The public does not benefit from irrigation exports. Indeed, irrigated agriculture only accounts for 1.5% of Oregon's GDP, and the damage that occurs to our water sources is not worth the paltry income or contribution to the GDP. Also, I'll point out that there is no moral or economic requirement that our imports of the food and the clothing that we wear, 4.2 million Oregonians, does not justify exporting or virtually exporting all this water and destroying watersheds, aquifers, dewatering streams, and causing a number of other harms that we'll show later on. There is no connection that because we happen to import our food, of which we import the vast majority of the food we eat and the clothing we wear, that we are necessarily required to be exporting products. And I will point out just the math and the economics of it is that 1.5% of Oregon's GDP does not pay anywhere near close enough to justify the imports we spend. The imports that we spend money on are many, many, many times more than the 1.5%. Communities and the ecosystems to which they are home suffer under the pressure of serving far-flung regions with water-intensive exports most Oregonians do not benefit from. This is a classic example of externalizing harms onto local communities. The results and the impacts are that domestic wells dry up, and that's a significant problem in the eastern areas of Oregon, east of the Cascades. In fact, during 2021 and 2022, Southwest Oregon experienced a lot of dry wells due to the organized crime syndicates that were pumping our groundwater dry. Groundwater dependent ecosystems also suffer. Shallow lakes serving birds dry up, especially along the Pacific Flyway. Water users dewater perennial streams and they kill fish. They heat the water up, and that is the water that remains. And it causes a lot of algal blooms, and then the cyanobacteria sets in. Also, subsidence occurs and aquifers collapse. And when that happens, they don't refill like they used to. So that's a serious concern. Lastly, cities question what their water futures are going to be like, because many of them hold junior water rights status to the irrigators that export forage crops. And I'll point out that cities use such little amounts of water, and yet they're held to the same standards of not being able to get new future water right appropriations because the irrigation sector broke the toy and made it impossible for the state to issue new water rights. And now cities are looking at their 50 to 75-year plans for drinking water accessibility, and they're scratching their heads because climate change is making it difficult for water recharge to happen every year. Meanwhile, they're still pumping like it's 1949 out in the fields, and the cities are junior irrigation water right holders in relation to the large scale irrigators. And so what's happening is that the cities really aren't going to be sure and don't know where their water is going to come from. Water scarcity is like all forms of inequality. Who gets the water is a political decision. And we're going to discuss the difference between water scarcity and natural variability. And this is an important distinction. Natural variability is, just like when the meteorite strikes and the dinosaurs, are made extinct. It's the ice age. It's all the various fluctuations that have occurred since time immemorial all over the earth. And it's also our 4 seasons: summer, winter, spring, fall. And generally speaking, we don't control natural variability, except, of course, that we have changed the climate by burning an enormous amount of fossil fuels. And so anthropogenic climate change is now impacting natural variability. But what I want to convey is that natural variability is typically the way the earth works, essentially. And it's distinct from water scarcity, which is a political set of decisions. Water scarcity is a result of policies that we control. And if you're familiar with some fundamental economic concepts with the law of supply and demand, scarcity is a condition where there is increased demand for any kind of product or service. And as soon as that demand increases, the service or the product is now deemed to be scarce. And once a product is deemed to be scarce, then you can control it and manipulate it for financial gain. The only way to use water for financial gain is if you can ensure that it's scarce. And even if there was a lot of water, then you would need to limit access to that water in order to create artificial scarcity. Because we have climate change and because we have impacted natural variability through anthropogenic means, burning too many fossil fuels, the water scarcity is increased beyond what would normally occur. And now that we also have a population of over 4 million people in the state of Oregon, the water scarcity is becoming uncontrollable, and it's starting to wreak havoc. But I just want to remind ourselves and to point out that water scarcity is to be controlled and manipulated in the exact same way that income inequality occurs and wealth inequality occurs. So we're in a 1 in 1,200 year mega drought, and we experience over appropriation of water rights in every basin, both surface and groundwater. And that is leading to increasing aridification of the West and declining aquifers and streams. So the dual whammy of climate change, a mega drought, and pumping too much water is causing significant problems. The volume of water on Earth is constant. And a lot of times we'll hear people say, well, the water isn't going anywhere. And that's true. However, its location and the quality of that water changes. If the water quality is low, you can't really use it. And if its location changes, you have no access to it. And we liken water scarcity to the result of like scaring off a deer. There's still deer around, but they're just not in your backyard. When modern humans occupy territory, we fabricate and expand these big built environments. And that includes like big industrial farms and cities and dams and roads and highways, all sorts of infrastructure. And we build these big structures by importing natural resources from the natural environment. In fact, scientists and policymakers use the import-export terminology of importing water and exporting waste and that sort of thing. And those are real statements. Every aspect of this activity requires importing water. All the work we do in creating and constructing our built environments and living in them requires importing water into those built environments or exporting it from the natural environment. And Oregon's history includes water uses related to, and you all know this, extirpating indigenous people, clear-cutting forests, nearly exterminating the entire beaver population, impairing waterfowl habitats by draining lakes and marshes, paving, poisoning and denuding soils, destroying the habitat for anadromous fish and surface water food chains, overgrazing regions with cattle, industrializing rivers and mining groundwater. And there's so much more. And all of these activities have always depended upon the use, extraction, and exploitation of water. The imposition of all policies are choices to create laws and how to implement them. And the imposition of water use policies have been to make all of those activities possible. So some of you may have heard of the term prior appropriation, which also goes by the name seniority. It means that whoever got in line first to the source of water or to the spigot gets to use that water, and that anybody who comes afterwards, if there's still water left, may use water, but should the water start to run low, usually during the mid to late summers, then anybody who is junior and came by later gets cut off. And so prior appropriation has been used politically to keep pumping water no matter if the water use harms others. And what they'll say is, so long as there's seniority, nothing can stop them from pumping. These politics are unlawful because they take the legal field, which is a legal term, that belongs to beneficial use. And beneficial use is a competing and separate doctrine. And it is a legal compact between the 1.5% population of pumpers and the greater public. And that is to not cause the public or their ecosystems they care about any harm. What I'll point out here is that you can imagine 2 or 3 water users up on a hill sharing use of a stream. And mind you, all that water belongs to the public. It's a public resource. And it's July, and they have over appropriated the stream. The state has given out too many water rights. And so now the senior water right holder is calling to the state to regulate off the junior water right holders so that the senior has the privilege of dewatering that stream probably sometime around September. And we are holding and we are pushing the state to back away from that failed and improper policy and to acknowledge that the beneficial use of water, which is as much an important doctrine as any in the state of Oregon regarding water use, is a relationship between those water users and the entire public. And so before anyone can use water for any purpose that's using a water right, it must first be within the public interest at the very least, not harm the public. And then once that determination has been made, they can fight over who gets to use the water in that stream. Last thing we'll point out is that dewatering any perennial stream during the summer can no longer be considered a beneficial use that's in the public interest. State officials, under intense political pressure from the largest water users for decades, have not held water in trust as their fiduciary duty requires. They may have thought they were doing so, and they may have tried, but it's been mostly a failure. They have allowed the privatization of water use policy by allowing water users undue influence in the lawmaking and the implementation of the laws. And I'll just point out that 1.5% of the population holds water rights. They use the vast majority of all water in the state. The benefits mostly accrue to them. The harms that are resulting from that water use are hurting the rest of the public and the ecosystems that they care about. And that small 1.5% are also the folks who lean on the elected and appointed officials to write the laws that benefit them. And this is a racket that is common with so many other industries. Settler conventional wisdom says that water equals money. And we've done our research and we've done our calculations. And say, for instance, east of the Cascades, alfalfa unlocks about 1/11 of 1 cent for every gallon of groundwater that's down there. And we can estimate how much financial value is left inside aquifers and streams by these calculations. In fact, ORS 536.310, which is titled Purposes and Policies to be Considered in Formulating State Water Resources Program, states that it is in the public interest that integration and coordination of uses of water and augmentation of existing supplies for all beneficial purposes be achieved for the maximum economic development thereof, for the benefit of the state as a whole. So the water equals money idea isn't just a consideration or an ideology, it is the law. And so if water equals money, then is it similar to gold and oil? Because we do mine for gold and oil. Because if we value water as an economic resource to extract and mine for financial value, it appears as if we will stop at nothing to extract water. This is Deer Creek, which is a major tributary to the main stem of the Illinois River. This is a friend. He's lived there for 50 years. He has domestic use water rights, and he has no water. This was 2021. They turned this lovely tributary into a gravel road in my own backyard. This is a northeastern portion of the Harney Basin in eastern Oregon, and it's in the Malheur Lake Basin. And you can see the crop circles and the alkali. It's almost like it's a work of abstract art. And this is what we're doing to the earth. And this is a desert where sagebrush would grow, basically. How much money is left after we extract all the value that we can from the land? I don't think there's probably going to be very much. We constantly seek to take the ecology and turn it into the economy. And we do this hammer and tong. It is in every aspect of our capitalist culture, take the ecology, turn it into the economy, use it up for its energy value, and then scat the waste out onto the earth. What happens when we mine the land of its water and determine that there's nothing left worth extracting? We're not far off. We hold that we must be more careful about how we separate water from land because the two substances form one entity. All water use policy is about managing the process of separating water from land. And when we extract water from land, we drain its life force. if it were the case that the water continues to reduce in volume every winter as recharge and discharge occur, this will be an increasingly losing proposition. If water equals life, and we believe water equals life, then it appears that we may be extracting ourselves. And worse, we are foreclosing on the future and extracting the lives of those yet to come. We believe that we're in conflict with our future selves. Frequently, you'll hear about that quote about whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. And it's a misunderstanding to think that the conflicts we may experience in the present are all the conflicts, when in fact, the real conflict is with the future. We believe that the public of the future is at risk. The environmental health of the ecosystem that we all rely upon for survival is at risk. Harming the ecosystem is like eating the seed corn. And in less than 200 years, we severely harmed our water sources, and the problem is worsening at an increasing rate. Since time immemorial, the indigenous peoples who lived here were able to shepherd and care for and steward the water sources, the land, and all the other creatures along together. And it just took almost no time, relatively speaking, for us to come in. And when I say us, people just like me, to wreck the place. We know that we are fighting the future with its hands tied behind its back, and that our descendants are the quintessential silent majority with no voice. They are not here to stand up for themselves, and if they're not here, then who is going to stand up for the future? I would like to consider myself and others as one. We are in a resource war with the future. All descendants and relatives are under assault by the present settlers. The flora, fauna, humans, rivers, lakes, mountains, glades, and meadows. Even our built environment is at risk. In his book on liberty, John Stuart Mill, and he is an important political philosopher from the 19th century, said that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. This is a widely held precept across the United States of America, Europe, and many other nations across the world. When water use harms others, that use is not in the public interest, and it cannot be allowed to persist. And so we're going to just have a little context here in the last couple hundred years. In the 19th century, water use only had to be beneficial to the user. That was it. You know, if you're out on a hillside somewhere and you tack a note to the tree and claim that this water is now yours after being party to extirpating the Native Americans and clearing the land and everything else, you just got a chance to use the water. Nobody else cared. But then in the 20th century, as the population grew, water use had to be in the greater public interest, or at the very least, it could not harm the public health, safety, and welfare. Now we argue in the 21st century, water use must be in the interest of the future public. It must be in the interest of posterity and future generations. So when we use water, it is not just for our own self-aggrandizement and slaking our own thirst. It is for others who are alive today, and most importantly, others yet to come. We must not only use water when it's beneficial to the greater public of the present. We must only use water when it is beneficial to the greater public of the present and the future. At the very least, water use cannot harm the public health and the ecosystem now and later. This is an important distinction because people will come running and say, well, I mean, you know, somebody can use water and it doesn't have to like benefit other people. And we can agree to that to a certain point, but at the very least, it can't harm others. And we call this the beneficial use of water for posterity. And since 98.5% of the public will never experience the privilege of owning a water right, especially since no more new water right appropriations are being offered in Oregon for the most part, then all the private special interest influence over our public officials to write and implement water use laws in the water user's favor, that amounts to the unequal protection under the laws when those laws are written to benefit a minority at the expense of a majority. I know that's a mouthful and that's a lot to take in, but just think about how there's a very, very small minority of people who have a privileged right to hold a water right and use the water that belongs to the public. And then what they do is they go and they arm twist and influence the elected and appointed officials to write laws and implement those laws in their favor. And then what happens is that those water uses cause an enormous amount of harm to the ecosystem, to frontline communities, and to others within the state. And then it also imperils the future. And yet these 1.5% water users who are not only influencing the laws get to benefit unequally while others are either not benefiting or getting harmed. And yet these laws are supposed to apply to all Oregonians equally. This is a significant unconstitutional system that we are experiencing. And Water League holds that many of the water laws and water policies that Oregon has passed in the past 110 years are unconstitutional because of the unequal protection under the laws. And this is a serious accusation. One of the most serious errors of all time is putting the present in seniority over the future. If you recall how prior appropriation, which is seniority, works, is that if somebody has a senior water right, they can regulate off the juniors. We argue that the present moment that we live in has seniority over the future, and that we are regulating the future off because the future comes later than us, and we're essentially making a call and regulating off the future for water. For all intents and purposes, the future is a junior water user, and we are regulating off our descendants. Correcting this horror costs nothing but political will to adhere to Oregon's Constitution. So to resolve our conflict with the future, we must acknowledge that every beneficial use today has an impact on tomorrow, some worse than others. We argue that the state of Oregon has looked at the credit side of the ledger, the beneficial use of water, and argue, well, okay, they can use the water and pump to their heart's delight in order to irrigate these, forage crops that are getting exported. But they don't look at the debit side of the ledger, and they don't look at what the consequences are of that beneficial use. And we hold that for every perceived benefit that comes from a water use, there is an equal and opposite negative impact that also comes in the form of harm. And that we have to be honest and true about the fact that every time we use water in some form, that we are always having an equal opposite reaction somewhere else. And we must research and understand more fully the negative impacts that result from the beneficial use of water. And at the very least, when we do have water present in our lives, that we use it for its highest and best purposes to live today for tomorrow, which is why we call on the beneficial use of water for posterity. And lastly, I just want to touch on the irony and inconsistency that our language makes it impossible to get away from the word use, which we are very interested in finding a way to do. So, but this is the paradigm that we're stuck in. A little picture here. This is Lake Abear in July 2021. The Shiwakan River is just essentially pumped dry. And this is Oregon's one beautiful salt lake. and it doesn't function when it's pumped empty and dry. This is, trees from August 22nd of this year, 2024, in Southwest Oregon. We're noticing, and we've been filming trees over the course of the past 3 years, watching them start to turn at the last week of July, first week of August. These are two similar trees. One's roots are not reaching water, the other is. You'll see it all over the state of Oregon. Trees are starting to have a very difficult time to reach water, because what's happening is that the groundwater levels are dropping in various places and in various basins across the state at different rates. And we're starting to see a stair stepping down of water levels. Every year, it usually goes down in the summer, but comes back up in the winter. But with climate change, the mega drought, and the overpumping, the recharge is not happening at a sufficient pace. And it's starting to now show up and be visible in many areas, one of which there are trees. Lastly, we'll say that never in human history have so many people pumped so much water away from themselves in an ironic effort to pump water towards themselves. The more we put electric pumps in our streams and in our wells, the more we are going to drain them. The water is going to evaporate away, hit the jet stream, and then as a result of climate change, it's not going to come back to us in sufficient amounts to recharge our water sources. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. There are a number of questions over in the chat, and maybe it'd be good. Those are the first questions asked. It'd be good to address those first.
Can you see them?
Can you see them, Christopher?
I sure can.
Yeah.
So I'll read the first one. How much does industry that is not big ag use of the overall water in Oregon, such as the Georgia Pacific Mill and recycling in the urban industry? So irrigation uses 78% of all the water in the state. And then if we look at domestic wells, they use 1%, and that's like 225,000. And that's like of all the surface and groundwater. And then the cities use what are called municipal public water supplies, and they service residential homes, they service apartment buildings, condo buildings, they service office buildings, they service schools, universities, prisons, they service all the different commercial uses, whether it's a bookstore or a grocery store or any kind of business. And then they also service all the industrial applications, which includes, if we had a steel mill, for instance, or a Facebook server farm, or any other kind of big industrial water use. And one of the things I'll point out is that in Oregon, 48% of the GDP comes from, no, let me step back. That's not correct. 30% of Oregon's GDP comes from what are called comes from water-dependent businesses. So let's say that again. 30% of Oregon's GDP is a result of water-dependent businesses. And those water-dependent businesses use 6% of the water in the state. And then if you look at irrigation uses 78% of the water, but accounts for only 1.5% of the GDP. So we're talking about the amount of water that big ag uses compared to a lumber mill or recycling or canning operations or urban industry. There's just no comparison. We did the calculation that the water-dependent businesses, which account for 30% of Oregon's GDP, uses water 216 times more efficiently than irrigated agriculture does in terms of GDP only. And since it's the law that water use must be for the highest economic use. We basically hold that irrigated agriculture is unlawful, at least on that level. Much of it is. And does that help? Would anyone like a little more refinement in that discussion, in that question?
Barb? Yeah. I wonder if you were able to break it down between, I mean, big ag is sometimes considered forestry, tree farms as well as food crops. So were you able to break it down between food crops, forestry, timber production, that kind of thing?
So timber production is its own thing. It's not agriculture. There are tree farms, and they really just don't use that much water. They might get established for a year or two with some drip tape, but really, this Christmas tree farms and that sort of stuff, they're essentially like a nursery, and they just don't use that much water. It's the seed crops, the forage crops, those crops use extraordinary amounts of water. And so the timber production and establishing small tree farms and such like that is a negligible amount that is, as far as we're concerned, not a concern. Now, we can talk all day long about the concerns of the timber industry, but their water use is not one of them.
And how about food crops as well as and winemakers?
So I'll talk about grapes and winemakers. Negligible amount of water. If you're in France and French winemakers look at the Californians and Oregonians, they think we're crazy that we irrigate our grapes, right? What do we know, right? Winemakers want to be able to get a proper sugar level. And so right about the time when fruit set begins, they all but try to kill their vines. I mean, they back off on water intensely. You will hear lies, and the lies are that grapes use huge amounts of water. Well, what they do is they count the amount of water that's used during the winter to prevent freezing. So you'll see that they put sprinklers on grapes during the winter to prevent freezing and harming the vines. Well, there's so much water that time of year, it's of no consequence. The rivers are full, they're flooding, they're overflowing, groundwater is, the water is accessible. So the wine and the grapes and that is not a problem. And then the amount of food that's actually grown that humans eat is just not that much. So much of what's grown in Oregon say even Oregonians eat it's really very small. The cherries that we export, the nuts that we export, that's just a negligible amount of water. The nursery sector happens to be the biggest, most financially rewarding sector. Like all the money for Oregon, so much of Oregon's income from the $5 billion comes from nurseries, and they don't use that much water. So the food, the wine, the nurseries, the tree farms, those regions aren't really big water users. Really, it's the forage crops. There probably are a lot of orchards that are exporting fruit out of the state of Oregon, and because they have to irrigate their orchards, there is a lot of water in that case. But also, Oregon is a important exporter, and I use the word important in quotes, of seeds, grass seed, carrot seed, you name it. And a lot of that is non-human food. Just to put a bookend on this comment, Water League argues that if we're going to import close to 90% of all the food that Oregonians eat, then we might as well be importing the forage crops that the cows and the pigs and chickens eat as well. It's a national market. The hay, across the Northwest or across the West is pretty much stable, the alfalfa prices. And so Quad Dairy, for a small amount of shipping, could be bringing in all the hay and alfalfa they need for their cows. Same with the other CAFOs that are meat steers and that sort of stuff. And we don't need to drain our aquifers and dewater our streams to feed these animals. We could be bring in the food in for the animals the same way we do the humans. And I'll just remind us that 80% of all the ag products in Oregon are exported out of the state. 40% cross state lines, 40% leaves the country, and with it goes our water in the form of virtual water exports. And so we don't even eat or drink that irrigation. Somebody else does. And because irrigated agriculture only returns 1.5% to our GDP, Water League argues that it's just not worth financially, it's just not worth the damage to our water sources. And we should come up with other ways to support the communities, the people who live in small towns, suburbs, and cities. I'll point out that since long before 1955, but that's where my records start, the population growth and growth in irrigation have decoupled. In fact, for the most part, the number of irrigated acres has plateaued in the last 75 years. Meanwhile, the growth in population has skyrocketed. And our figures show population grew by almost an order of magnitude percentage-wise over irrigated agriculture. So irrigated agriculture is an industry that has absolutely nothing to do with Oregon's population. Whether we had 1 million or 4 million or 8 million Oregonians, that has nothing to do with how much irrigated agriculture we have. Because 80% of all the irrigated agricultural products, well, I can say that 80% of all Oregon agricultural products are exported out of state. We don't use them. It has nothing to do with our population.
Wow.
Yeah, it looks like you've answered a lot of the questions in the lineup. There's one at the end there. What is the action that responds to the problem? How does your organization challenge the injustice?
So Water League believes that we've had 100 and some odd 50-year experiment of letting the water users call the shots and tell everybody how water use should be managed. And they have had a chance to influence our elected and appointed officials, and it's been an abject failure. They have an extraordinary conflict of interest. Their interest is to get the elected and appointed officials to write water law policies that enable them to pump with impunity, regardless of the harm that's caused to the public interest or the ecosystems. And they have been very successful with their political pressure and political power over the years. And by our count, less than a couple thousand people are involved using and pumping most of the water and managing it. And it's time for Oregon's 4.2 million residents to stand up and take charge of the water that belongs to them. More people need to have access to being able to have a voice in the management and the governance of water. And so Water League's mission is to engage the public in water stewardship. That includes a number of different activities, mostly education, so that the public understands better more of what concerns them. How many times have we had a concern, but we really didn't fully understand it? And it's common to have concerns about things, but we don't fully understand it. So we hope to inform and educate and engage the public along the concerns that they have, so they're more informed about them. So if they wish to take action, they can take action with more effect and more success. And so education plus action is a big portion of it. Water League also is a bit of a think tank, and we produce policy papers based on a lot of research. And we have one paper called The Beneficial Use of Water for Posterity. Another paper critiquing the policies and the way the state thinks about water. It's called Modernizing the Conventional Wisdom, which is an assessment of how the state has functioned and operated over the decades in terms of forming water policy and what the ideologies are. And we critique extensively and stridently the conventional wisdom, which we define as where common sense goes and hits a brick wall, and you still don't like what your answer is and you want to get a better answer, you move into the incredulous region of the conventional wisdom, where incredulity exists. So it's beyond what the average person would consider common sense. So we work to assist in the rulemaking. You're familiar with how state agencies write administrative rules, and that occurs after statutes have been passed. There needs to be a number of rules that are written to help streamline and better understand how to implement the statutes. A lot of times agencies have specialists and professionals and experts who know how to do that. I am a strong believer in the experts. I am a strong believer in science. And I strongly believe that the staff, for instance, at the Oregon Water Resources Department really possesses the professional qualifications to write administrative rules to benefit the public. I will also say that it is my view that the staff at the Oregon Water Resources Department strongly believes and holds that their mission and their goal is to hold water in trust. When I do critique the state, I don't give the Water Resources Department a pass when they don't deserve one. I also do not give elected officials or other appointed officials a pass. I do believe, however, for the vast majority of them, their heart is in the right place and they're doing a fabulous job under extremely strenuous political situations and conditions that I would never want to have to be under myself.
Yeah, thank you, Christopher. That's, I think, a great presentation. Appreciate you. I appreciate all the information you gave us, and we're out of time now. And I'm sure you have way more information you could give us in the future if you have the availability. Deb, one last.
Yeah, I was going to say, Chris, you just made a profound statement about that the people who are working in those systems have good intention, and I'm wondering, how does the public support what they're trying to do and help, neutralize the lobbying happening by that wants to keep the status quo in place?
So, well, you can reach out to Water League and we can assist and guide you and other members of the public how to provide public comment, public testimony, how to reach out to staff and write them emails. One of the critiques that Water League has, which is increasing daily, is that there is a paradigm shift that is happening and needs to happen faster, which is that the Oregon Water Resources Department is like a clientele business. Their clientele has been the 1.5% water right holders at the expense of the other 4.2 million Oregonians. And so the idea that they're their clients means that they work with them and they serve them at everyone else's expense. That's changing. And I encourage members of the public to reach out to the Oregon Water Resources Department and engage them in the management and the governance of water that they care about. You'll find them to be very receptive. I also would be happy to help out getting engaged in rulemaking, getting engaged in the upcoming legislative session where they are seeking to modernize Oregon's water code and to address concerns about local water issues that anyone might have. One of the points I'll make is that this is a community rights organization, and there's a lot of tension between state law that oftentimes preempts local community rights actions and activities, and very sensitive to that. One of the ways that community rights have typically approached the state is to sometimes come from a somewhat, I wouldn't say combative, but, hey, look, leave us alone, let us do our thing, and the state says, no, you're preempting state law. And what I have found is that the state, surprisingly, and this goes against everything I've ever believed, but my own personal experiences will say that on many levels, the state is actually willing to work with communities and create open spaces and create open places for communities to act. And when there is a concern for preemption, I have seen members of the state of Oregon, especially in the Water Resources Department, work with local communities to try to find out what it is that they need, what they want, and what they can do to achieve their concerns. And that includes place-based planning and planning within communities that the department can support and assist. They really, I believe, want what's best for local communities. And again, they're under an enormous amount of political pressure to maintain a failed status quo that is deeply problematic. Yeah.
Right. Well, we're a little past time. We really appreciate your presentation, Christopher. And yeah, look forward to researching your website. And I take it a lot of the things you cited are on your website.
That is correct. Waterleak.org. You can just kind of scroll down towards the bottom middle and you'll come across a number of papers. You can also visit WaterLeague's Facebook page. I think if you just go to Facebook and type in WaterLeague, we have a group page. It's called the Water Action Community, and you can become a member and join the group if you'd like. Just type in Water Action Community on Facebook. And then my information is, you can find it pretty much anywhere. It's on our website, again, waterleak.org. And if you want, my email is very simple. It's chris@waterleak.org. And I'm accessible 7 days a week.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks again.
Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for being a part of this.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much. And don't hesitate to reach out individually, however you wish.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Good night,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Good night.
Night.
Thank you, Chris.
Bye-bye.